Good evening, everyone. Thanks for making it out in the rain. Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. I'm Julia with the Events Department, where we host in person and virtual offerings along with a number of partnered events, trips, and classes. You can find our full calendar online at politics-prose.com/events. At this moment, please take a second to silence anything you have that might make noise, your phone, a Tamagotchi, a lightsaber I don't know about. Please put that away. Keep in mind our current masking policy at the front of the store. Feel free to hop up and grab one. Once the discussion for this evening has concluded, we'll open the floor to audience Q&A. At that time, you'll be prompted to line up at the microphone you see to your right. Don't feel shy. We'll prompt you to do that, but please form an orderly queue there. And we'll conclude with a signing at this table. If you haven't already purchased a copy, and I encourage you to do so, of Elliott Morris's Strength in Numbers, How Polls Work and Why We Need Them, you can stop by our registers at the front of the store, pick up a copy for that signing line. Last bit of business. When we wrap up, our one ask of you is that you take responsibility for the chair you're sitting in. Hop up, fold it, please put it against a shelf or something else that's sturdy. That clears some floor space for the signing line and helps our event staff get out of here faster on a rainy night. All right, we're very excited to welcome Elliott Morris, celebrating the publication of Strength in Numbers, How Polls Work and Why We Need Them. An insightful exploration of political polling and a bold defense of its crucial role in a modern democracy. Morris argues that the larger purpose of political polls is to improve democracy, not just predict elections. Persuasively argued and deeply researched, Strength in Numbers is an essential guide to understanding and embracing one of the most important and overlooked democratic institutions in the United States. The author is a data journalist for The Economist, where he writes about American politics and elections, based here in Washington, D.C., and moderating this evening, we're lucky to have Jamelle Bouie, a columnist for the New York Times and political analyst for CBS News. Bouie covers campaigns, elections, national affairs, and culture. Previously the chief political correspondent for Slate magazine and a staff writer at the Daily Beast, and held fellowships at the American Prospect and The Nation magazine. Please join me in giving a very warm PNP welcome to Elliott Morris and Jamelle Bouie. Thank you both so much.
Hello. Thank you. Is this on yet? I think it is. Sounds on. Okay, great. Thank you for coming. Hello, Elliot.
Hey, thanks for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Nice to meet you in person. Let's just get started, because this is a very interesting book, and I was sort of riveted while reading it, and I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to get out. So, to start, and I'm sure you've been asked this question already, why did you write this book? Why did you write what is both a defense of polling, a history of polling, but also sort of an affirmative argument for polling's place in democratic life?
Well, I guess it kind of sounds crazy in hindsight to write a book about polls after 2016 and 2020. But I'm not a pollster, common misconception, but I read, I guess, almost all the polls that are germane to what I'm covering, and an election forecaster, so all the polls are entering those processes of my work. So after the most recent two elections, when there were these catastrophic narratives of how bad the polls performed, my research and polling says, well, you should expect some of these errors X% of the time or whatever. We can get into how those predictions are made later. And so I wanted to write this book, originally like 2019, about people are wrong about the polls. Here's the science and the art of surveys and of forecasts. And so I'm doing a bunch of reading from the archives of the American Political Science Association and American Association for Public Opinion Research, all the academic research journals for this stuff. And what comes across there is not like this statistical take about, oh, polls are going to be wrong this percent of the time. Don't trust them every single poll you read. But a real deep connection between, or a commitment from the pollsters and the polling academics to democracy. And that is, what seemed missing from the broader conversation about polls in the media, at least, especially from where I was sitting as a data journalist. And that's the threads that I pull on throughout the book. That seemed much more interesting to me, and so that's what the book became.
I'll say that's the part of the book that was most interesting to me while reading it. Sort of not just, and in sort of the details of polling and of sort of what various things meant was interesting, but kind of from the start. I mean, the book opens with a discussion of ancient Athens and of Athenian democracy, and sort of it opens and begins with not just a discussion of polling, but a discussion of public opinion and what public opinion is, and sort of the emergence of public opinion as a recognizable part of political life. And I think that there is, I like to hear you talk about that aspect, because I think in modern America and like modern democratic life, we take for granted that there is a thing in the world called public opinion, the aggregate views of everyone. But this is the thing that this was an idea that had to be developed, and you trace its development, which I thought was just like a fascinating thing to see someone actually put out, chronologically.
Yes, I mean, all this seems so connected to how I first learned about polls and public opinion, which was, in my like undergraduate government classes or whatever, which also wasn't that long ago. And so when I'm approaching, how am I going to, the question of how am I going to explain polls to regular people or to very sophisticated consumers of polls, both in a new way and in a way that makes a contribution, the democracy angle seems the natural place to start. So if you're only ever consuming polls as predictions, I guess, of an election far in the future, or even of what pollsters like to say, snapshots in current time, then you're not thinking about the broader implication of what you're doing, which is, I mean, on a fundamental level, like a microcosm of the democratic process. Like every time a pollster takes a poll, at least a fair pollster and a fair poll, what they're doing is democracy at some level. So there's some old quotes from the president of the American Political Science Association, 1995, who says polls are the most rigorous and egalitarian democratic process there is, again, if they're being conducted correctly, because they give every single person an equal voice in participating in that sort of microcosmic democratic process. So that begs the question, like, what is the democracy we're all fascinated with, or participating in multiple stages? So that's where the ancient Greek history lesson comes in. And arguably you could start a history of polling earlier. Some early parts of the book talk about the first censuses, which might go back as far as like the Babylonian era, or maybe even further back than that in China. And there you have the original counting of people, the original enumerations of populations. It's a couple tens of thousands of years after that before you have the original democratic societies. And if the book doesn't get into the whole, maybe there are other democracies in Greece we don't really talk about, but we'll leave those to like the Greek historians. And that's the start of any philosophizing about government should match what the people want it to do, even though they don't have a particularly egalitarian definition of people, but what have you. Those like versions of democracy are very different than the ones we have now, right? There's this saying in American politics right now, especially on the right, that we're not a republic, or we're not a democracy, we're a republic, whatever. They were direct democracies, we're indirect ones. But if you have at the time, right, Aristotle even writing that if the people making up a society do not feel represented by their government, then it's evident it's like going to collapse into a tyranny, or in of itself into chaos. I don't think we're close to chaos in America today, although some people might want that. we might be arguably closer toward the other end of that spectrum. But if you're looking for something deeper in polls, I think that's a good place to start, is the real normative meaning there, the real democratic process.
Right. Sort of to go back to the observation about census, sort of even the mere act of counting lots of people in that way, trying to figure out who exists in the community, is constituting that community in a way. It is helping create and bring that community into being. And in the same way, the process of polling sort of like presupposes the existence of this singular political community whose will you want to represent. And part of the book, especially in the earlier chapters, is working through this question of should the general will even really be represented, because this is sort of the recurring dilemma of American government. Like, to what extent should the general will, should the public opinion be actually represented in the operation of government? And there is a portion in the midpoint where you quote Rogers, is his name?
Lindsay Rogers.
Lindsay Rogers, who makes the argument that, polling is actually quite dangerous because it undermines some of the deliberation that the American system is trying to engender. And so this is a long way of asking, sort of, what is your case for making public opinion such an integral part of democratic life? Like, isn't it? Maybe we are a republic, not a democracy, but whatever we are, deliberation is supposed to be part of the process. And so, what is the relationship of polling and public opinion to deliberation?
So what I'll say is, in reading some of the original pollsters, George Gallup is a name we'll all know, but there's others, Elmo Roper, Archibald Crossley, etc., all of whom are characters in this story of polling in the book. In reading their work, Lindsay Rogers, I think, gives them misconstrues them pretty heavily. The original pollsters are not saying that the government should do everything that a poll says. They are saying, in Gallup's words, that polls should be an advisory referendum. And you could think about using polls as inputs into some democratic process, right? So I'm a data journalist, so we'll think about it in like a modeling term, where the output is some policy or whatever. The inputs are, I guess, the quality of certain decisions, and the political scientists also say, right, there's this matrix where interest groups and activists and public opinion and the right decision are all sort of acting in this input into the formula of democracy or government, let's say. And so that's a long way of saying they're only one input. That's the position of the first pollsters, and I think that's the position in my reading and interviewing of pollsters today. So I'm certainly not arguing for, again, what Sidney Verber would call a government by the survey, or by surveys. I think that's a horrible idea. I'll put that up front. The book does not make that case either, because that would be particularly dangerous, right? To have no deliberation in the process, to only make decisions based off of what the polls are doing, is also sucking up a lot of other information that's not just what they want or not, and not what's good for them. So, right, sometimes people aren't going to have informed opinions on things. Sometimes they will have the wrong opinions for them. But the other thing that I think we forget polling does is it also gives the government an idea of like what policy areas the people need addressing right now. So the questions we get are not only, do you support welfare, but are you income burdened? Can you afford food? Does your family have like public transport to get where it needs to go, or are you like relying on a broken down car to get places, which would be bad for your quality of life? Do you need affordable health care? If not, what do you need? So, I guess that just raises another question or another point, that polls are also not always binary. The pollsters have what are called open-ended responses, where people can just write as much as they want. That's one of the benefits of modern online polling. And so all along way saying I think of polls as informative tools that government leaders could use to better the democratic process in certain ways. But sure, Rogers has some points that are right, that if you have a government by survey, there's also a lot of danger that comes from that. But I don't think any pollster, I'm certainly not arguing for that either.
There's this interesting problem with the American political system as it currently exists. Is we have
only one interesting problem.
There's only one interesting problem. There are many interesting problems. I don't know, interesting the right word for that. But there are a number of problems, and one of them I think relates to this, which is that the U.S. system, the House has been the same size for almost 100 years. The Senate is obviously 100 members, and the population of the U.S. is 330 million plus people, and so it's sort of inherently difficult for even the most attentive representative to really get like a good sense of what's going on in their district, what's going on in their state, and certainly for a president, what's going on with the country. And so polling can obviously serve this purpose of supplementing information for lawmakers. But then you do still get this question of how to decide once you have the information. And I'm just sort of curious about your thoughts about sort of how one balances public opinion against these other concerns and interests. You have an anecdote in the book about Lincoln would convene groups of ordinary people in the White House during the Civil War to kind of get their do a vibe check, right, with the common man. But
they were his public opinion baths.
Right,
what he
right,
called them.
yeah. I always
bath is a sort of vibe check.
I like all Lincoln stories like that because he seems like a really weird dude, honestly. But that's to say that like Lincoln would take in this information, but then he'd also have to balance a whole host of concerns, political concerns about sort of what his actual objectives are as president are, and then come to a decision. And so what, I'm just curious your thoughts on sort of the actual decision-making process once you have the polling information.
Yeah. Well, it might help to think of the counterfactual modern democracy where we don't have polls. So, and maybe on a certain policy. So take like gun control, right? Public opinion polls today say, 80 or 90% of the public support universal background checks. And, we can have a whole debate about whether or not the polls are representing referendum results or whatever. I think that they're representing something properly there. And 60% or so of the country, maybe 55%, depending on how you ask the question. Again, right, it's how you do a good poll is a thorny subject. Support banning assault weapons. Without polling, all we really know is that there's never been a proper vote since 2013 on universal background checks, and neither a majority or minority in the Senate or the House has taken up an assault weapons ban as a full-throated supported position since 2004 when the assault weapons ban expired. And so you're left with a picture of public opinion there as informed through the outputs policy that there's no reasonable level of support for these two things. Polling tells us that there is. So, however legislators are using that information as inputs into their processes, we can determine that by whatever differences we observe in policy now versus that counterfactual, I guess. That's one way to think about it. And that would tell us that, some politicians are listening to public opinion. Now, I guess, to go back to Rogers' criticism and Verba's quotes, like, we wouldn't expect a politician, say a House member from a district, to represent their constituents on every decision, especially if an issue has 50.1% or whatever, assuming polls can be that precise, which they can't, support for background checks. But we would want them to take the public's opinion into account. Without polls, I guess they could have public opinion baths, but you can't. What's the average size of a constituency now? Almost 700,000 people. You can't have all of them in your office in Congress, right? Rayburn's already small enough. You're going to get interest groups calling your activists, giving you skewed perceptions also. So this is admittedly a hard question to answer. How are leaders actually rationalizing about this information? But that's because it's not the only input. So one other anecdote. One of the first examples we have, and that the book tells a story of, is in the 1960 presidential campaign, when John F. Kennedy contracts with the first example of a micro-targeter, which is just this like company that can tell you how different groups are going to vote based on studying public opinion data. The actual interviews that they use, just by funny stories, that they come from Gallup's survey data that he collects like 20 years earlier, and they do a bunch of statistical math that like makes their conclusions suspect in certain ways, and the book tells you why you wouldn't want to do that. And they are contracted by Kennedy and the DNC to come up with the answer to this question, which is, if John F. Kennedy makes a speech embracing some sort of civil rights act, will he do better with voters in the Northeast and with black voters? And so they have to conduct these simulations. They have to, Simulmatics being that's the corporation that's contracted to do the micro-targeting. They have to take their information from Gallup and like run it through early computers. So they're like programming every single American's vote and feeling on civil rights on like Fortran cards, on index cards that you would feed into a computer. You don't just type on your laptop back then. Those computers would fill this whole room. And extracting an answer. And they tell John F. Kennedy, yes, you should embrace civil rights in some sort of speech for electoral purposes. And, at the same time, he's getting counseled every which way from his brother, from other political actors, and from his pollster, Lou Harris, who disagrees with Simulmatics. So even there, what is the public opinion at the time for John F. Kennedy on civil rights? But polls are already sort of offering a muddied signal. So that's a long-winded way of saying, we don't expect even right now people to make all their decisions based on the polls. But it seems that consulting the information, which is what we want.
And there are some other prominent examples. You talk about FDR's use of polling and trying to calibrate his message. And then Nixon, who seemed to just really love polling and kind of really use it to shape his entire administration. Yeah.
So even before you had Simulmatics, you had FDR's pollster, election forecaster, named Emil Herja, who was this, he was the son of a Finnish immigrant family living in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is like this, in this tiny town. This town, Crystal Falls, only has 1,300 people today. So back then, basically no one lived there. And Emil Herja is a really interesting character. He, maybe much like many smart New Deal men, just does everything. He, at one point, is both a miner in Alaska and also writing newswires about the mine in Alaska, and then taking other information about, where people had struck gold. Maybe you could go to that mine, feeding it to both other newswires and the employees of the mine there. He owns a newspaper in Breckenridge, Texas, which is at that time a small, and this is later, or before actually the Alaska anecdote, at that time an oil boom town. And he basically does the same thing there, and he calculates how much oil they're outputting, and he gets really into statistics. He corresponds with some of his Finnish immigrants, family in the Finnish immigrant community back home in Crystal Falls, and learns how they actually do the statistics of mining, which is really just a matter of you hit a rock, and if there is ore there, then you've sampled the area and you mine there, and if there's not, you find some new area to sample, which is interestingly kind of what polling does. And then he goes to work on the New York Stock Exchange, and he tracks oil in and outflows and early securities trading.
I just love this era because it's what are your qualifications? I don't know. I hit some rocks. I
go trade on Wall Street.
Yeah, go trade on Wall Street. Go ahead. Go work for a president. Sure.
And then he gets bored of that, and he wants to get into politics, and so he first pitches the 1928 Democratic National Committee in 1928 to say, can I do electoral math for you? Can I tell you where in the country the Democrats are flailing, and maybe you'd want to put more money there or whatever. You can address that problem as you want, and you don't have to pay me. I'll do it for free. And they say, no, you're a crackpot. Go away. That's not how we do politics in 1928. We're going to do what we want to do. And he comes back in 1932, and he says, "Hey, FDR, let me do this for you." And he says, the chair of the post office, in charge of the post office, this man James Farley, who's also in charge of the DNC at the time, says, "Sure, we're not going to pay you, but if you're going to give us information, I guess we'll take the information." And he's like wildly successful. He takes polls that Gallup had been conducting, very, very early polls, and some of the straw polling surveys. I might be getting ahead of myself here, from the Literary Digest, which is like a famously bad example of polling. And he adjusts them, and he forecasts the election outcome with incredible accuracy. He says FDR is going to win by 7.7 million votes. Like, to put this in perspective, we don't even give forecasts for actual votes now because there's like, it's not really intelligible, but also it's a really hard thing to do. We get forecasts for percentages instead. And FDR wins by 7.1 million votes. So he says, "Oh, like, this is the best soothsayer I could have on my staff. I want him in the White House." And so he provides information to FDR on where the country sits, both on their approval of the president, but also how they feel about like the Works Progress Administration, different New Deal programs, like the Industrial Recovery Act, or something. And he also does this really also New Deal era, like 1928 min job thing of giving out patronage positions in this New Deal bureaucracy of the United States federal government, and only giving them to FDR's supporters, people who stalwartly supported him early on, or giving them to congressmen or other leaders from places that were that had marginal congressional races, so that they could, maybe get someone in their corner to spend more money or more time in the district or campaign for them or whatever down the road. So he's like the first election forecaster, and he's used not just to forecast elections, but to affect the democratic process downstream, which, we can think about whether or not that's a good thing. I think in this case, he is putting the patronage position stuff aside. I mean, there's already problems with the patronage system anyway for handing out jobs. Maybe he tweaked something here and there for marginal efficiency for FDR. But what he's doing at the fundamental level is telling the president or then candidate Franklin Roosevelt, these parts of your agenda are really popular, giving people jobs, or maybe, hey, they're not so popular, but when people learn about them and they get informed, deliberative, hashtag takes on them, then they like it. And so he gives speeches about how good the WPA is, about how many jobs it's providing, and public opinion changes on the WPA. Like, I think in hindsight, we should obviously say WPA is a really good program. I mean, maybe some people would disagree with that, but empirically, I think we should say that. And so therefore, I think he has some positive return for democracy during that era. Okay, well, you also asked about Nixon.
Yeah.
But he sort of does the same thing without his own sort of Wizard of Washington crystal gazer, crystal falls, as Emil Hirsch called it at the time. He has what looks more like what presidents have today, which is an office of public opinion in the White House where you have multiple pollsters. You also have interns collecting public opinion data and telling the president, hey, your approval rating went up like 0.2 points yesterday, like maybe don't talk about whatever you talked about yesterday, or hey, in this case of Nixon, your opinions on the Clean Air Act and like women's equality are actually particularly popular, but not among your base. So don't talk about it in red areas, talk about it in blue areas, which was sort of interesting. But Richard Nixon's also sort of like he's super narcissistic with the way he consumes public opinion data. He really wants to know what his approval rating is, and that's about it. You hear a lot from Nixon. So political scientists have gone back and they find you hear a lot from Nixon around the time when he's popular. You don't hear a lot of speeches from him when he's unpopular, which is kind of, that's one step abstracted from don't talk about things that are unpopular or whatever. Like, don't be in public when you're unpopular and show your face when you're popular. I mean, that's like a very narcissistic use of polls, I'd say.
You mentioned the bad polls of the Literary Digest, and there's a portion of the book that is about kind of trouble in polling, bad methodologies, all of that. And so, I think you you began talking about the misfires, or the apparent misfires of 2016, of 2020, and I think I'd be interested to hear more just about sort of what you perceive as the problems in polling and the kinds of kind of dangers and mistakes that have been made over the last few years.
Oh, this is super fascinating. But I kind of want to do an exercise real quick if people want to give like
Sure.
input real quick. We'll take a brief break from polling talk. I don't know. I'm sort of surprising Jamelle with this too. I don't know how many of you follow Jamelle on Twitter like religiously, like I do. He gives reviews of cereals, which I think is one of your big value adds to society today.
Oh, yeah.
In which you usually say like, these are horrible. Do not ingest them, especially if you're a child.
It's more of a bit for people to see me eat bad stuff.
Well, I guess we can talk about what other bad stuff you eat too. But I wanted to pick the next cereal for you to do, and obviously you don't have to be wedded to this decision like the democratic process. But I figure this would be also an interesting exercise to like, do a poll of the people who shut up. So I have 5 cereals. I'm going to ask you like a pollster. First, I'm going to give you the question, then you're going to like raise your hand in order because there's so many of you. Of the following 5 cereals, weird technical questionnaire glitch. One of them is gone, so now you know how polling really works. There's actually only 3, which sort of makes both of our jobs easier. So of the following 3 cereals, which one would you most want to have for breakfast tomorrow? So the options are Fruity Pebbles, basic, Captain Crunch Oops All Berries, which is all of the berries from Captain Crunch, and Hershey's Kisses cereal, famously nutritious. So we'll do it in order and just raise your hands. I'm gonna have to count you in order. So it's again Fruity Pebbles, Captain Crunch Oops All Berries, and Hershey's Kisses. So Fruity Pebbles tomorrow morning. Do you eat Fruity Pebbles? We have 1, 2, 3. Oh shit. Y'all like Fruity Pebbles. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I see 10 people. Okay. This is interesting. It's almost fitting my priors. Captain Crunch Oops All Berries. Yeah, I thought so. Okay. I see 16. This is also a really interesting way to count how many people showed up tonight. Hershey's Kisses cereal. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is disgusting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I see 10 people. I also saw a hand go down, which is technically non-response bias. Okay. So the winner is with 44% of the votes and a margin of error of 22 percentage points. Captain Crunch Oops All Berries.
I'll do it.
Okay, so the question is, what's wrong with polling? So there are a number of things wrong with that poll. First off, if we're trying to represent everyone who would give Jamelle an opinion on the cereal to eat tomorrow, we would want a different audience. This is not a representative audience. We don't know the demographic characteristics. The actual audience, or the cereal preferences, or whatever is correlated with cereal preferences. But we also omitted some responses in the question also. So questionnaire design is a really important part of polling. And someone put their hand down, which is a type of polling bias called non-response. So in the real political world, not the cereal tasting world, the fundamental problem with polling is that you cannot reach everyone you are trying to talk to. So if you take a poll of 1,000 people to represent the adult population of what I think is now, after this census, around 260 million people, U.S. citizens, you're missing 259 million of them. So pollsters use statistics to say these 1,000 people, if they are drawn randomly from the population at large, represent the 260 million. But of course, they're not drawn randomly because maybe not everyone has a cell phone or a landline phone or is on the internet, all ways to do a poll. That's called coverage error, where not everyone is in the sample. Maybe some people you call don't answer the phone. And if that's predictable based off your demographic traits, it's not so big of an issue because pollsters can figure out, if certain populations aren't responding. So that's non-response. That's one issue. There's the measurement error issue, which is like omitting parts of your questionnaire, or maybe asking people if they support abortion in cases of murder or something, like horribly biased question, which is, people ask that question. Not really so much anymore. And all those types of errors are not strictly accounted for in the pollster's traditional margin of error. So pollsters do this other calculation, which is, okay, based on the random chance that I've drawn an unrepresented group of 1,000 people. With all that other stuff put aside, there's this margin of error, maybe that when I was giving you 22 points or whatever in real life would be like 3 percentage points. That doesn't take into account all the other stuff we've talked about: measurement error, non-response error, and coverage error. And so when pollsters have gone back and studied this, they find the real margin of error for a survey is like at least 2 times as wide as the margin of error that we are given. And then I guess to sort of bring in the examples from the book, the Literary Digest poll, which in 1948 is what we call a straw poll, not a scientific survey, because the way it's conducted is the Literary Digest magazine would send you a postcard and ask you for your vote, or in the magazine they would print out a ballot that you would cut out and would mail back. So already they don't have a representative sample. They have Literary Digest readers or people who are sent the mail. And in the case of 1948, they're sent mail only if they're registered as an owner of a telephone or an automobile, which is not that many people in 1948, especially not people who would be more likely to vote for Franklin Roosevelt. So you end up, or if you're the Literary Digest, you end up with a poll that says Franklin Roosevelt is going to lose by 24 points, or lose by 12 percentage points to the Republican challenger Alf Landon, when in reality he wins by 24 percentage points. So they're off by 38 percentage points. That's the Literary Digest. Now, pollsters have figured out since 1948, because we have computers and actual statistics now, how to control for some of those problems. Pollsters use this thing called weighting, which makes sure that the percent of white and black and non-college educated and college educated Americans, what have you, matches what's on the census. So that way they're talking to a representative portrait of Americans, at least those who are interviewed by the census. But that only fixes issues of non-response if you put the precise variables into the statistical calculations. So it's not really a fixed problem, as as I guess reporting on polls that just say X is support for the candidate A is like 10 percentage points would have you believe it's an estimate that has a margin of error and can be severely biased by the process that's generating that number. And in 2016, you don't have a lot of responses from non-college educated white Americans, so pollsters end up underestimating support for Donald Trump. And we have sort of downstream election forecasting errors too. And then in 2020, many pollsters say, okay, well, we learned our lesson, let's weight by college education. We'll make sure we have, and the interaction of college educated and race. So they make sure they have the right share of college educated black and non-college educated white Americans in their samples, and so therefore, if everyone's being honest about who they're going to vote for, it should roughly match the election results. But in 2020, you have a worse polling error. And that's because non-response has shifted from the non-college educated white group to people who are more prone to support Donald Trump. So if you look at surveys from the states in 2020, you'll find bigger misfires in polling averages and election forecasts in areas with more Donald Trump supporters. And then if you actually look at polls that interview people off of the voter file, you'll find, if you want to predict response to that poll, because they know if you picked up your phone or you didn't pick up your phone, that's also correlated with support for Democrats. So now, after 2020, we're sitting here like, okay, well, we don't want to repeat the Literary Digest mistakes, so we'll use statistics. All right, we don't want to repeat the errors of 2016 and 2020, so we will wait on something. There's no estimate of the number of Donald Trump and Joe Biden supporters in America at any one time that's accurate to a decimal point or something. So pollsters can't solve that problem with their traditional tools. So they go back to the drawing board. So in the book, I tell the story of pollsters trying to fix their methods after 2020, and they want to design better polls. So they want to interview people not over the phone or online, but by mail. Some of them are trying face-to-face polls now as a way to increase response rates among those groups that aren't responding to polls via other methods. Some polls are recruiting samples with mail surveys with response rates of almost 30% now. So as comparison, a telephone poll today gets a response rate of like 1%. So 30% is pretty good. And maybe that'll work. But we won't know until we observe the next election, or we have another benchmarking survey from a big polling group that says, okay, our pollsters aren't representing people who own refrigerators or something. That's a government benchmark that pollsters use. It's important. I heard a snicker, but it's an important tool. And so you're left with this tool that is like this microcosm of the democratic process that is used by government leaders, by election forecasters and news coverage, by unelected leaders targeting policy outputs, stories of the book on there in that regard too, and by interest groups. And maybe they'll be more accurate next time, but you don't really know because the process that's generating those numbers is breaking down in ways that we don't have that pollsters don't have concrete solutions for. So that seems very bleak. Like your polling's not broken, but what we call in statistics this data generating process is breaking down in certain ways that could lead to higher errors in the future, and you don't know until that happens. But on the other hand, polls they're still giving us a pretty good read of both election vote intention and issue preferences. So other studies of issue preferences have found that public opinion on, say, abortion or what have you is more accurate, perhaps, than pre-election polls. So we can sort of trust those signals a little bit more. But the average error there might be 1 or 2 points on a question that pollsters really have figured out that doesn't have a lot of measurement error, or 10 or 12 points on something that has a lot of measurement error, and that's really correlated with partisan response. So you're left with this tool that's really important, that's breaking down, in which we're trying to push government actors to do what the people want, but there's no surefire solution. So I think what leaders should do is say, okay, this poll I'm getting from X advocacy organization or from Y New York Times report is a reasonably good indicator, but I'm not going to make all my decisions off of it, and I'm not going to blast it out in like a campaign fundraising email or whatever, and try to shore up support based off of that 1% over the 50% mark, because it might not be real. But if you have a policy that's supported by 80 or 90% of the people, that's definitely above 50% if it's asked correctly.
Before we get to audience questions, I wanted to ask you one last thing, and that is that in the conclusion of the book, sort of granting all of the issues, all of the problems, you do make a case for sort of greater use of polling in public life. So if you could just say a few words about that case, about why we maybe should be using polls a little more than we even do.
A few words. So one way this could work to elevate the voice of the people through polls in Washington D.C. or in state houses is to have interest groups that are dedicated to trying new polling methods and testing their assumptions and their processes, and then giving those signals to leaders. Right? We have pollsters that do this today. The Pew Research Center is a really good example. Other pollsters also do this, and they publish 4 or 5 reports every single day about what the people want according to the Pew Research Center polls, and then those get used. Those get circulated by the press, by the sort of political establishment and elite in Washington and elsewhere, and they get used to steer public debates and maybe to put pressure on lawmakers. But we can sort of imagine an environment where you don't just have one group doing this, you have 4 or 5, and maybe they come from different parts of the ideological spectrum too. And all of those errors that you might expect from ideological biases are eliminated by that sort of scattering along the spectrum. And then maybe you also get better polling methods because you have more people trying this. Their reputations and maybe the fundraising dollars they get are tied to accuracy or to the number and subject of the surveys they're putting out. And that, that's like one thing we could try. We don't have that. So if we're wondering about things we can do, maybe looking for new industries to create or areas to target with money and a sort of response from the pollsters is one thing you could do. But I think the sort of more fundamental problem is the news coverage and I guess conventional wisdom and the public's priors about what they're expecting from surveys is wrong. We are expecting hyper accuracy before elections. Well, read the book, you'll very quickly be assuaged of that expectation. They're expecting maybe election forecasts with like 99% probabilities or whatever for their preferred candidate. Well, read the book and we understand why those probabilities aren't so instructive, but they're also damaging to this broader purpose of polling, which is to elevate issue polls, not pre-election polls. And that's, as I interviewed pollsters after 2016 and 2020, that's what they kept coming back to me and telling me. For every poll that they do or every question they ask on pre-election vote intention, they do 10 or 15 other polls on issue attitudes, and that's what the pollsters are interested in. So, I think the book, if I may, is important in saying, like, change the channel in how you're consuming public opinion polls. Think about them as tools for democracy, something they can do better than just predicting an election. And that's not new. Pollsters have been saying that for a while. But to the extent that their voice isn't breaking through, I think it's obviously not. And I think that people would be better served if they sort of changed what they wanted from the polls. Also, I mean, that's going to be really hard because there's an intense interest. Like, I think there's a weird human or maybe societal interest in knowing the future, especially who's going to govern you. So we're obviously going to have pre-election polls, but if we can change how we're covering them from the press's side, but then from the sort of putting my citizen hat on, how I'm ingesting that information and making decisions based on that information and calling my legislators based on that information, whatever, I think that also puts polls on a better footing for the future.
Right. So if you have a question, there's a microphone up here. So just come on up and ask a question. And if it's not a question, I'll let you know.
Hi. I have a question about the role of. I am a pollster, but I have a question about the role of. In the discussion about the book, and I think in general, polls are sort of elevated to a position of sort of polls are elevated from sort of the dirty work of politics, right? Polls are some source of truth. They sort of set the groundwork for the political engagement, and then you can use polling to help inform your decision making. But I'm curious for your thoughts on weaponizing polling and the role that polling has been weaponized politically. Jamelle, you said that polling in some way constitutes the helps communities sort of constitute themselves. You sort of painted a picture, and I think we probably grant too much authority to polling. But I'm curious for your thoughts and reaction on that, and how polling is used and weaponized by organizations in politics.
I think the easy way out of the question is. If someone's weaponizing polls, they shouldn't be weaponizing them. You should be using them for good or whatever. I mean, that's pretty cheesy. But you can, there's other sources of information that are weaponized by these people too, right? It's not just the polls. It's maybe you take an isolated news incident and you use that for your report or your conventional wisdom narrative writing, or for your campaigning or whatever. So, it's impossible, I think, to figure out if polls have been weaponized more than other sources of information, or if they, carry more authority in driving XYZ outcomes. if the alternative is we shouldn't have polls at all, obviously for the as per previous hour, I think that's worse than weaponizing isolated incidents of weaponizing polls.
Sweet. So I was actually going to ask this question before the very end, but I think you maybe got to it a little bit, which was distinguishing between horse race polling and issue polling. But I was a staffer on the 2020 Warren campaign. We would get responses all the time from voters about how we love the candidate, we love what you're talking about, but we don't think you can win, and therefore we're not going to vote for you. In a way that almost became self-fulfilling. And I think a lot of people, some people have pointed to a specific New York Times poll in October that maybe made a significant impact there. Do you think in general, and maybe we can expand this from horse race polling to issue polling as well, but do you think in general there is a conservative tendency, a small c conservative tendency in polling to crystallize public opinion around certain options? Or you even talked about like limiting political imagination in a way that is a dangerous tendency. Do you think that is outweighed by other factors? Or do you think that that tendency exists, maybe it's a force for moderation, and is actually something healthy, a service that polls give to democracy?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a Democrat in 2020 or a Republican in 2020 or 2016 or whatever, if you're a partisan and you want your side to win, then a public opinion poll is giving you valuable information. And maybe we don't like the outcome, or maybe people give too much certainty to that one poll, and we shouldn't be reporting on one single poll from the New York Times in like every other outlet or whatever. Just like we shouldn't be reporting on like a campaign poll in every single outlet and treating it as truth, as there not being any room for debate about electability of Warren in 2020 versus Biden or the other candidates, or what have you. So I would say if that was true and Democrats want an electable candidate, then it's a valuable indicator. But I would also say there's other data that you could use to figure out who's an electable candidate. But then before polling, right, they're rationalizing in basically the same process without the data. So you can imagine if Elizabeth Warren, if you have a 2020 election and Elizabeth Warren is sort of on the fringe, maybe ideologically or whatever we're thinking, whatever the narrative is, and you don't have the polls that say she's down by 4 or whatever in October, and I think like working class whites in Wisconsin don't want to vote for her. I think this is the story. And then maybe she does even worse because like they don't like her, or they think she's too ideologically extreme. But I think people are making the same, partisans and in Washington are like making the same rationalizations without the polls anyway.
If I can just give a quick thought, it's interesting to think of it in terms of like the structure of the political system, right? Sort of when you have a less democratic primary system or less democratic system for choosing candidates, then there's a certain amount of public opinion gauging still happening, sort of like, does this candidate play well in this kind of environment, et cetera, but it's much less central, right? Sort of it's value judgments based off of, interest groups and managing coalitions and that kind of thing. But in a world of democratic primaries, lowercase d, where voters are actually choosing the candidates that will run under the banner of the party, then polls do take on a much greater significance. And perhaps the solution to the dilemma here is to, maybe the candidate selection process has gone too far in one direction versus another, right? And so the way to solve it is to sort of actually reduce the input of voters and increase the input of elites. I don't know, but it's just like I'm thinking of it in terms of sort of like what does the actual structure of decision, what kind of information does that take in? Does that sort of put out a premium?
You might be also like think that the two-party system is putting those pressures on people to want someone who's electable, who will defeat the other candidate at all costs. And in some other, parliamentary or other multi-party democratic system, then you would have other, people would have other preferences in the selection process, and polls would serve some better purpose there. So maybe it's like a psychological thing, not a polling thing.
Can I ask a very quick follow-up? Sorry.
I don't know. And we don't have a ton of time.
Sorry, go for it.
Sorry. But you can email me.
I'd love to, actually.
Hi. You mentioned you talked about like weighting people who respond to polls as a way to kind of match it up, make sure that the population is representative of the population as a whole. Sorry, the sample is representative. So how does that work when you have a 2020 census that was, for all kinds of different reasons, probably significantly less representative of the population of America? Yeah, I was wondering, like, how are they accounting for that?
So there are already polls coming out that are weighted to the results of the 2020 census, but because we know it undersample, this is admitted by the Census Bureau, obviously, because they're statisticians, not like partisans or whatever. That the census undersurveyed voters in certain states, and especially Latinos, then whatever composition metrics they have are going to be biased against those groups. There's also this huge change, which is sort of not really talked about at all so far, in the way that the census asked the race question and giving more responses for non-white categories, which increases the sort of voters of color percentage, but in non-predictable ways. Pollsters like to distinguish between people of color as Hispanics, blacks, AAPI, something else, but the census is sort of doing that, and they add another category, but pollsters haven't added the other category. So whatever metrics there are being weighted on are going to are kind of going to be wrong. Like there's going to be an extra margin of error there. So what pollsters should do is probably be honest about this. Say we don't really know the demographic percentages of the population on these metrics or whatever, and try to control for it. Ask the Census Bureau, hey, what's your estimate of the margin of error for the benchmarks, and then add that in. And what you're going to end up with is polls that are really, pollsters would be honest in telling you this. The margin of error for their survey of a 55-45 race includes like 52-48 in the other direction because of all the extra error or whatever. I think that's more honest. My position after writing this book is maybe we can use polls still that have large margins of error, especially if we have lots of them, and especially if we're more honest about this instead of treating the individual surveys as truth or whatever. Maybe the answer is we have no idea how wrong they are, how biased they are. They're not broken or whatever. They're not catastrophically wrong, but we don't know how biased they are.
I'm going to jump in, and I'm going to cheat somewhat by asking a question to which I also have an answer. And that question is...
More of a question than a comment.
How can I get a copy of Strength in Numbers by Elliott Morris? And the answer is, please, at the conclusion of this event momentarily, head to our registers, grab a copy. We will have a signing line up here. If you'd like to get your copy signed or personalized, please line up where I'm currently standing. Our last reminder, too, before we all applaud as we wrap up the event, is please take responsibility for your chair. Fold that up, put it against a shelf to give us some more space here. And again, not a question at all, but just a sincere thank you on behalf of Politics and Prose to Elliott Morris, Jamelle, Bouie. Thank you both so much for being here this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thanks to everybody for coming.